In 1847, a Hungarian doctor working in the maternity ward of Vienna General Hospital noticed something that nobody else wanted to look at. Women who gave birth in the ward staffed by medical students and physicians were dying at a rate of roughly 10%. Women who gave birth in the ward staffed by midwives were dying at a rate of under 2%. Same hospital, same building, different staff, dramatically different death toll. The doctor's name was Ignaz Semmelweis, and the difference he identified, the thing that was killing one group of women and not the other, was not bacteria because germ theory had not yet been developed. It was not a virus. It was not a miasma or a curse or a failure of the stars. It was hands. The medical students and physicians were coming directly from performing autopsies on cadavers and then delivering babies without washing their hands in between. The midwives were not performing autopsies. Their hands were clean. The women delivered by the physicians were being killed by particles of decomposing human tissue transferred directly from the morgue to the maternity ward by the unwashed hands of the men who were supposed to be saving their lives. Semmelweis ordered handwashing with chlorinated lime solution. Mortality in his ward dropped immediately to under 2%. He had discovered empirically one of the most important principles in the history of medicine, and the response from the medical establishment was not gratitude. It was ridicule. Physicians were gentlemen. Gentlemen's hands were clean. The suggestion that a physician's hands could carry death was an offense against professional dignity. Semmelweis was dismissed, his findings ignored, and he eventually died in an asylum in 1865, still unable to convince the mainstream medical world of what he had proven with his own data. But here is the part of this story that gets left out of the history books. What Semmelweis discovered was not merely a fact about germ transmission. It was a revelation about the entire history of human cleanliness. Because if unwashed hands could transfer deadly contamination in a Vienna hospital in 1847, then the question of how people cleaned themselves in the centuries before soap became ubiquitous is not merely a curiosity about ancient hygiene habits. It is a question about survival, about which practices, developed across thousands of years of human civilization without any understanding of microbiology, accidentally protected people from the invisible world that was trying to kill them. The answer to that question is one of the strangest, most unexpected, and most consequential stories in human history. And it begins not in a bathhouse or a river, but in a kitchen. Mesopotamia, roughly 2800 BCE. The earliest written record of something resembling soap is a Sumerian clay tablet found at Nippur, dating to approximately 2200 BCE, which describes a cleaning preparation made from water, alkali, and cassia oil. Water and alkali and fat, the three fundamental ingredients of soap used for cleaning purposes. The tablet is brief, technical, and entirely unconcerned with the broader implications of what it is describing. It is a recipe written by a scribe, preserved in clay for 4,000 years, pulled from the ground by an archaeologist, and translated by a scholar who probably did not fully appreciate that they were holding the world's oldest cleaning manual. But the Sumerians were not the origin of the practice. They were the first people to write it down. The practice itself is almost certainly much older, and it probably began, as so many human discoveries begin, by accident. Picture this: a cooking fire, animal fat dripping from meat into the ashes below, a woman reaching into the ash pile later to clean the cooking area, and noticing that her hands came away cleaner than they went in. That combination, animal fat and wood ash, which produces a potassium hydroxide solution when wet, is a crude but functional soap. The saponification reaction, which is the chemical process by which fat and an alkali combine to form soap, does not require a laboratory or a chemist. It requires fat, ash, and water, all of which were available in every human settlement in the world for as long as humans have been cooking with fire. The Sumerians codified it. The Egyptians refined it. A papyrus from around 1550 BCE describes a substance made from animal and vegetable fats combined with alkaline salts used for treating skin diseases and for washing. The Egyptians were fastidious about bodily cleanliness. Their religious practice required ritual purification, their climate encouraged perspiration and the infections that followed it, and their status as a literate bureaucratic civilization meant that they wrote down what worked and passed it forward. But here is what changes the story entirely. Here is the detail that most histories of hygiene never quite grapple with: soap as the ancient World understood it as the Sumerians and Egyptians and later the Romans and Greeks understood it was not primarily used for washing the body. It was used for washing cloth, for treating skin conditions, for cleaning wounds. The idea of using soap to regularly clean the entire surface of a living human body the way we understand bathing today was not universal, was not obvious, and in many periods and cultures was actively considered unnecessary, suspicious, or even dangerous. The Romans cleaned themselves without soap. This is a fact that tends to produce disbelief in people encountering it for the first time, because the Romans are famous for their baths, the thermae, those enormous public complexes of heated pools and cool pools and steam rooms that could accommodate thousands of bathers simultaneously. The ruins of the Baths of Caracalla in Rome cover 27 acres. The Baths of Diocletian could hold 3,000 people at once. Roman bathing culture was one of the most sophisticated and socially pervasive cleansing practices in the ancient world, and they did it without soap. The Roman method involved oil, a scraper, and water in that order. A bather would enter the warm room, allow their body to sweat, then apply olive oil over the entire skin surface. The oil loosened dirt, dead skin cells, and accumulated grime. Then a curved metal tool called a strigil was drawn across the skin, scraping away the oil along with everything it had trapped. The resulting substance, sweated oil and scraped debris, was collected, and in a detail that will either fascinate or horrify you depending on your sensibility, it was sold. Athletes' strigil scrapings were considered medicinally valuable and commanded a market price in Rome. The sweat and oil of a successful gladiator or charioteer was bottled and sold as a cosmetic product. The Romans were, in this respect, the inventors of celebrity-branded skincare. After strigiling, the bather rinsed in progressively cooler pools, ending in the frigidarium, the cold plunge, which was thought to close the pores and invigorate the body. The whole process, when performed properly in a well-maintained bathhouse, was extraordinarily effective at removing surface contamination. Oil is a powerful solvent for the sebum-based grime that accumulates on human skin. The strigil physically removed the contaminated layer. The successive water baths rinsed the residue. The Roman bather emerged genuinely clean, without a gram of soap ever touching their body. The social function of the Roman baths was as important as the hygienic one. The bathhouse was where Romans of different social classes met on relatively equal terms. Slaves bathed alongside freedmen, merchants alongside soldiers, old men alongside young ones. There was a small entry fee, subsidized heavily by the state, which kept the baths accessible to citizens without means. Emperors competed to build the most magnificent public baths as a demonstration of munificence. Going to the baths was not an act of personal hygiene performed in private. It was a social ritual, a civic institution, a daily demonstration of belonging to Roman civilization. And then Rome fell, and the baths closed. And what replaced Roman bathing culture across medieval Europe is one of the most misunderstood chapters in the entire history of human hygiene. The popular image of the medieval European as a filthy, unwashed, disease-ridden figure who bathed perhaps once a year and considered cleanliness a vice is not merely an oversimplification. It is, in most of its particulars, wrong. The medieval world had a rich, varied, and in many respects sophisticated culture of personal cleanliness. What it lacked was the infrastructure of the Roman bathing system, and what replaced that infrastructure was a set of practices so different from modern washing habits that they have been consistently misread by later historians as evidence of neglect rather than adaptation. Medieval Europeans washed their hands constantly. This is not a minor detail. It is the central organizing fact of medieval hygiene culture, because in a world where everyone ate with their hands and shared communal dishes and food was prepared without the benefit of running water or refrigeration, hand hygiene was both a social requirement and a genuine matter of survival. Medieval table manners, which strike the modern reader as elaborate and somewhat excessive, were largely organized around the requirement that hands be visibly, demonstrably clean before and during eating. Guests washed their hands before sitting down. Water was brought to the table between courses. The ablutions were performed in front of others, not merely as a private act, but as a social display of cleanliness and respectability. Medieval people also washed their faces and necks and other exposed skin regularly, using water and sometimes herbal preparations. They cleaned their teeth with rough cloths and herbal powders. They changed their linen, the undershirts and shifts worn next to the skin, frequently, and in periods when washing the body was not practical, changing the linen was understood to serve a cleansing function. The linen absorbed sweat and body oils and was washed separately. This practice, changing linen as a form of hygiene, was so central to medieval and early modern cleanliness culture that, for centuries, the quantity and whiteness of a person's linen was one of the primary visual markers of their cleanliness and social status. But what about bathing, full immersion bathing, the kind involving hot water and a tub? Medieval people bathed. The historical evidence for this is extensive and largely ignored by the popular narrative. Medieval estate records, household accounts, and sumptuary regulations all contain references to bathing tubs, to the heating of water for baths, to the employment of servants whose duties included preparing baths for their employers. Monastic rules specified how often monks should bathe. The Benedictine rule permitted bathing several times per year, and the phrase several times per year sounds shocking to modern ears, until you consider that we are talking about monks in unheated stone buildings in northern European winters, for whom preparing a hot bath required enormous quantities of firewood and manual labor, and was a genuinely significant undertaking. The secular wealthy bathed more frequently. Medieval towns had public bathhouses, the stews they were called in England. The word survives in the language in a different context, because medieval bathhouses were so frequently used for prostitution that the stews became synonymous with brothels, and the word eventually lost its connection to bathing entirely. But in their original incarnation, the stews were public bathing facilities where ordinary townspeople could, for a small fee, have access to hot water and a tub. They were social spaces as the Roman thermae had been, and they were used by people across the social spectrum. The Church's relationship with bathing was complicated in ways that historians have consistently oversimplified. The claim that Christianity discouraged bathing is partly true and mostly misleading. Some early Church fathers did suggest that excessive concern with bodily beauty was a form of vanity incompatible with Christian humility. Some ascetic traditions valued the rejection of physical comfort, including the comfort of being clean and warm. A small number of saints were specifically celebrated for never washing, as a demonstration of their indifference to the flesh. But these were extreme positions, celebrated precisely because they were exceptional. The mainstream Church required ritual purification before taking the sacraments. It prescribed bathing at specific points in the liturgical calendar. It built and maintained bathhouses at its monasteries. The Christian attitude toward cleanliness was not hostile. It was theologically complicated in ways that produced a variety of practices depending on time, place, and individual interpretation. What genuinely changed the European bathing culture was not theology but plague. The Black Death arrived in Europe in 1347 and killed between one-third and one-half of the population within a few years. The medical understanding of what caused it, operating entirely without germ theory, entirely without knowledge of the Yersinia pestis bacterium and the fleas that carried it, was that the disease spread through air. Specifically through the bad air, the miasma thought to emanate from rotting material, swamps, bodies, and diseased environments. If disease entered through the air, and if the pores of the skin were an entry point for air, then opening the pores through hot water bathing was literally inviting the plague into your body. Medieval physicians, operating with sincere care and the best available medical theory, began advising their patients to avoid hot baths during plague outbreaks. The advice was wrong, but it was rational given the prevailing understanding of disease transmission. And it was heeded, particularly by the educated, literate urban population who read the medical advice and followed it. The closing of public bathhouses in plague-ravaged cities was a public health measure, taken in good faith, based on a model of disease that was entirely mistaken. The public bathhouses never fully reopened. The combination of plague fear, the association of bathhouses with prostitution, the increasing cost of firewood in deforested northern Europe, and the shifting social norms of the early modern period conspired to gradually eliminate the public bathing tradition in Western Europe. By the 16th and 17th centuries, full immersion bathing had become uncommon even among the wealthy, and the linen-changing practice had become the primary cleanliness strategy for Europeans of means. Queen Elizabeth I of Engel, and was reportedly proud of bathing once a month, whether she needed it or not, a phrase that was recorded approvingly, not satirically. because monthly bathing was considered unusually fastidious for the era. Louis XIV of France, one of the most powerful monarchs in European history, is said to have bathed fewer than 3 times in his adult life. His personal hygiene was managed entirely through the changing of linen, the application of perfume, and the use of dry powders. The perfume industry that developed in early modern Europe, centered in Grasse in southern France, which still produces more perfume ingredients than any other region on Earth, was in large part a substitute for bathing, a way of managing the olfactory consequences of infrequent washing. Meanwhile, in other parts of the world, bathing cultures were thriving in ways that European visitors found astonishing. When Spanish conquistadors arrived in Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital that occupied the site of modern Mexico City, in 1519, they encountered a city of perhaps 200,000 people that was, by almost any measure, cleaner than any city in Europe. Tenochtitlan had a sophisticated sewage system, regular street cleaning, and a public health infrastructure that included special canoes to collect human waste and transport it for use as agricultural fertilizer rather than allowing it to contaminate the water supply. The Aztecs bathed daily in the Temazcal, a steam bath not unlike a sauna, heated by pouring water over fire-heated stones, in which bathers used aromatic herbs and rough plant fibers to clean and exfoliate their skin. They cleaned their teeth with charcoal and herbal preparations, they washed their hair regularly, they changed their clothing frequently. The conquistadors, arriving from a Europe that had largely abandoned public bathing and was managing its hygiene with linen changes and perfume, looked at the Aztecs and described them as startlingly clean. Bernal Diaz del Castillo, one of the Spanish soldiers who recorded the conquest, described Moctezuma's personal hygiene routine with evident respect. The emperor bathed twice a day, wore fresh garments at every meal, and maintained a standard of personal cleanliness that Diaz found remarkable partly because it was so different from what he had grown up with. The same contrast appeared when European explorers encountered the bathing cultures of Japan, where the communal hot bath, the onsen and later the sento, had been a central social institution for over 1,000 years. Japanese Buddhist temples had bathing facilities from the 6th century CE onward. The practice of bathing in hot mineral springs was documented in the Nihon Shoki, one of Japan's oldest historical chronicles, and was associated with purification, healing, and spiritual practice. By the Edo period, beginning in the 1600s, public bathhouses were distributed throughout Japanese cities and towns with a density that made daily bathing accessible to virtually the entire population. The Japanese standard of personal cleanliness was, by European standards of the same period, extraordinary. In the Islamic world, cleanliness was not optional. The Quran specified ritual purification, wudu, the washing of hands, face, arms, and feet before prayer, as a religious obligation performed 5 times daily. The Hadith, the recorded sayings and practices of the Prophet Muhammad, described cleanliness as half of faith. Islamic religious practice required full body washing after certain states, including sexual intercourse and menstruation. The hammam, the public bathhouse, was an institution of Islamic urban life as fundamental as the mosque, and Islamic cities from Cordoba to Cairo to Baghdad maintained elaborate networks of public baths that served the entire population. When the Crusaders arrived in the Holy Land in the late 11th century, they encountered a bathing culture so thoroughly integrated into daily religious life that some of them found it bewildering. A few adopted it, most did not. The Frankish knight Odo of Duel, writing home during the Second Crusade, described the cleanliness of the people he encountered in Constantinople with a mixture of admiration and confusion. Admiration because the bathhouses were magnificent, and the people who used them were genuinely clean. Confusion because this was so different from the world he came from that he did not have the cultural framework to fully understand what he was seeing. The contrast between Islamic and European hygiene practices during the crusading period was sharp enough that it generated documentation on both sides. Arab historians describing the Frankish crusaders repeatedly noted their infrequent washing, their strong body odors, and their apparent indifference to the cleanliness standards that Islamic religious practice required. The crusaders, for their part, sometimes adopted local bathing practices after extended time in the region, and faced criticism from home for doing so, because bathing in the Eastern style was seen by some European commentators as a form of cultural contamination, a dangerous adoption of foreign habits that threatened the spiritual integrity of the Christian warrior. Hygiene had become political. How you cleaned your body was a statement about who you were, whose civilization you belonged to, and what values you held. This dynamic, the use of cleanliness standards as a marker of cultural identity and moral worth, would become enormously more consequential in the following centuries, when European colonial expansion brought European hygiene norms into contact with the diverse and sophisticated cleaning practices of the rest of the world. The story of soap's transformation from a specialist cleaning product into a universal moral requirement begins in earnest in the 18th century, when the chemistry of cleaning started to be understood scientifically for the first time. The French chemist Nicolas Leblanc developed the process for producing soda ash sodium carbonate at scale in 1791, which dramatically reduced the cost of the alkali component of soap and made industrial production economically viable. The chemist Michel Eugene Chevreul spent years in the early 19th century systematically analyzing the chemistry of fats and alkalis, and published, in 1823, the definitive scientific account of the saponification process, the chemical reaction that produces soap. He identified the individual fatty acids that compose different fats and showed precisely how they combined with alkalis to form the soap molecules that give soap its cleaning properties. This knowledge transformed soap manufacturing from a craft into a chemistry. Previously, soap makers had worked from recipes handed down through generations, adjusting their processes by feel and experience without understanding the underlying chemistry. Chevreul's work made it possible to design soap formulations scientifically, to predict how different ingredients would interact, and to produce soap of consistent quality at industrial scale. The soap factories that appeared across Britain and France and the United States in the early and middle decades of the 19th century were operating on chemical principles that their predecessors had lacked entirely. The result was a dramatic increase in soap production and a dramatic decrease in price. By the 1840s and 1850s, soap had gone from a product that ordinary working-class families purchased sparingly and used primarily for laundry to a product that was cheap enough to use daily, if the cultural context existed to encourage daily use. The soap manufacturers needed to create that context. Their greatest tool was advertising. The second half of the 19th century saw the emergence of the first truly mass-market consumer advertising, driven by improvements in printing technology and the expansion of newspapers and periodicals with national readership. Soap manufacturers were among the earliest and most aggressive users of this new advertising infrastructure. Pears Soap, Sunlight Soap, Ivory Soap in the United States, these brands invested heavily in advertising that did not merely describe their products but constructed an entire narrative about what clean meant and what dirty signified. The narrative was deeply embedded in the racial and imperial politics of the Victorian era. Advertisements for major soap brands consistently presented whiteness and cleanliness as synonymous, and darkness and dirtiness as synonymous. The civilizing mission of the British Empire, the ideology that justified colonial rule as a benevolent project of bringing civilization to the uncivilized, was explicitly linked to soap in advertising that depicted colonized peoples being washed clean by European products. One famous Pears soap advertisement that appeared in periodicals of the 1890s showed Britannia washing a dark-skinned child with the implication that soap was the instrument through which civilization was transmitted to the world's unclean peoples. This advertising is disturbing to read now, and it should be. But it was not disturbing to most of its original audience because it reflected and reinforced assumptions about race, civilization, and cleanliness that were thoroughly mainstream in Victorian Britain and its colonial territories. The equation of European cleanliness with European civilization, and the corresponding equation of non-European peoples with uncleanliness, was a piece of ideology that served colonial power by making racial hierarchy seem like a natural consequence of differing standards of personal hygiene. The scientific and public health dimension of soap promotion developed alongside the racial civilizational dimension, and the two reinforced each other in ways that made the overall message about soap enormously powerful. Germ theory, the understanding that infectious diseases were caused by microorganisms that could be transmitted through contaminated hands, surfaces, and water, was established by the work of Louis Pasteur, Robert Koch, and their contemporaries in the 1860s and 1870s, and filtered gradually into public awareness over the following decades. The germ theory provided a scientific rationale for the hygiene behaviors that soap advertisers had been promoting on moral and aesthetic grounds. If germs caused disease, and if soap removed germs, then soap use was not merely a marker of civilization or respectability. It was a matter of life and death. This framing soap as protection against the invisible microbial world was enormously more compelling than the earlier moral framing, because it replaced a social obligation with a survival imperative. You did not wash with soap because it made you respectable. You washed with soap because if you did not, invisible enemies would enter your body and kill you. The soap manufacturers did not invent this message. The public health community developed it sincerely, based on genuine scientific evidence about disease transmission. But the soap manufacturers amplified it, shaped it, and directed it in ways that served their commercial interests. The line between public health education and soap advertising became increasingly difficult to draw, because both were delivering essentially the same message through overlapping channels to the same audience. By the early 20th century, soap use had been successfully transformed in the popular imagination of the industrialized world from a personal choice into a civic and hygienic obligation. Public health campaigns in the United States and Britain promoted handwashing in schools, in workplaces, in public facilities. The First World War, which saw military medical services battling wound infections and epidemic diseases in the trenches, generated massive public messaging about cleanliness and soap use. Soldiers were issued soap as part of their standard kit. Posters and pamphlets distributed to civilians emphasized that keeping clean was a form of patriotic service, a contribution to the war effort, a way of protecting the men at the front, by ensuring that the home front remained healthy and productive. The advertising industry, developing the psychological sophistication that would come to define 20th century consumer marketing, understood that the wartime framing of cleanliness as duty could be extended and deepened in peacetime by making uncleanliness feel not merely unhealthy but shameful. The concept of body odor as a devastating social liability, as a condition that would cost you your job, your relationships, your reputation, was largely constructed by advertising in the 1920s and 1930s. The word halitosis, meaning bad breath, existed in medical literature before the 1920s, but was unknown to the general public until the Listerine advertising campaigns of that decade literally invented it as a mass consumer anxiety. Listerine had been used as a floor cleaner and a surgical antiseptic before the company decided to market it as a mouthwash, and the campaign that drove its adoption, built entirely on the manufactured fear that bad breath was destroying people's social and professional lives, is one of the most studied examples of anxiety-driven advertising in the history of marketing. The same pattern, identify a natural bodily condition, reframe it as a social catastrophe, sell the solution, drove the expansion of the soap market through the 20th century. The daily shower, which is now so completely normalized in the industrialized world that questioning it seems eccentric, is not a response to genuine biological necessity. Human beings do not produce enough sweat, oil, or odor in 24 hours to require daily full-body washing with soap to maintain basic health or social acceptability. The daily shower is a cultural norm, and like all cultural norms, it feels natural and inevitable to the people who grew up with it. But it was not always the standard and is not the standard everywhere today. There are dermatologists and microbiologists who argue that daily soap washing of the entire body, particularly of areas other than the armpits, groin, and feet, strips the skin's natural microbiome of beneficial bacteria that help regulate skin health. The skin is not a surface to be scrubbed clean of everything on it. It is a living ecosystem, inhabited by trillions of microorganisms that play genuine roles in maintaining the skin's barrier function, regulating its pH, and protecting against pathogenic bacteria. Disrupting this ecosystem daily with detergents may actually compromise the skin's natural defenses rather than enhancing them. None of this is to argue against soap. Handwashing with soap is one of the most effective public health interventions ever identified. Washing with soap in contexts where pathogen exposure is likely after contact with sick people after hand dealing raw food after touching surfaces in public spaces genuinely saves lives. The evidence for this is as solid as any evidence in the history of public health. Semmelweis was right. But Semmelweis was right about hands in a maternity ward, not about daily full-body scrubbing in a private shower. The expansion of his specific, targeted, evidence-based recommendation into a comprehensive daily hygiene regime covering every square inch of the body was a commercial project as much as a scientific one. The soap in your bathroom is the beneficiary of 5,000 years of accumulated chemistry and public health knowledge, but it is also the beneficiary of 150 years of very effective advertising. The Roman bather who emerged clean from the thermae without a bar of soap in sight was not dirty. The medieval merchant who changed their linen every morning and washed their hands before every meal was not neglecting their hygiene. The Aztec bather in the Temazcal and the Japanese bather in the Sento and the Muslim performing wudu 5 times a day were all maintaining genuine, effective cleanliness by the biological standards that actually matter, reducing pathogen transmission, managing skin health, preventing the accumulation of contamination. They did not need soap to be clean. What they needed was exactly what Semmelweis finally proved: attention, habit, and the understanding that the invisible world can kill you if you give it the opportunity. The rest, the daily shower, the lathering from head to toe, the anxiety about body odor, the ever-multiplying personal care products that line the shelves of modern pharmacies, is not the history of cleanliness. It is the history of commerce. And that history began the day a salesman looked at a bar of soap, looked at a person who had never bought one, and decided that what he needed to do first was make them afraid.